we doing this morning? Yeah, there we go. Welcome. Well, we are back in at the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ. My name is Victor. So excited to be with you. I'm one of the pastors here on staff. If you were here last week, you heard an amazing sermon by Pastor Fanu, and it was all on chapter 12. Chapter 12, things start unfolding pretty drastically. We now see this figure come on the scene, and we know that figure is the dragon. John makes that clear in chapter 12, verses 9. This dragon is the devil, the Satan, the serpent of old. So the cards are now on the table. And what we are now investigating in chapter 13, we'll spend all our time there, is this dragon now mobilizes these two beasts. He sends them to do his bidding. And these two beasts, which Scott McKnight calls Wild Thing 1 and Wild Thing 2. Probably a little too cute for what they actually do on the earth, but this is the beast of the sea and the beast of the earth. Now, this wouldn't have been like unfamiliar language for the original audience. Job 40 and chapter 41 as well, we see descriptions of the Leviathan, this sea monster, and this beast of the earth, the behemoth. And especially that first one, the idea of a sea monster would have resonated with the original audience quite a bit. Through Jewish mythology or even theology, it was often believed that dark forces resided deep in the sea. When you hear stories like when Jesus casts out demons, and he casts out a whole bunch of demons out of one man, and they don't know where to go, and Jesus commands them to go into a group of pigs. It's a really strange story. And these pigs then immediately go straight off a cliff into the deep waters. There's another story also with Jesus, a very popular story, you've probably heard it before, of Jesus falling asleep in a boat, and you have these disciples who are trained professional fishermen crossing the waters. They would have understood weather, they would have understood the waters, they would have understood like times when to go in the day, and they are in the midst of now a storm that they can't even handle. So much so that they wake Jesus up and they say, "Do you even care? We are going to die." And Jesus does, if you know the story. He stands up and he rebukes the wind and he rebukes the waves, and the whole thing goes calm. Well, commentators think that they think there's actually more at work in that story, that Jesus and his disciples are going into new territory in their ministry that they have not yet gone before, and potentially there is resistance, spiritual resistance to Jesus moving into that territory. So what he is silencing is maybe more than just the wind and the waves there. And so for a sea monster to come out of the ocean is pretty on brand with what they would have expected dark forces to come from. So let's read about our first beast. Verse 1 all the way to verse 8. "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like bears, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. One of his heads seemed to have," this is great. This is like perfectly in time. You're going to see this verse, probably a verse you've never read before in your life. You're going to see it plastered all over social media right now, thinking this is probably speaking about Donald Trump's assassination attempt. "One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. And the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast." There you go. End time stuff, guys. "And they worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, 'Who is like the beast, and who can fight against him?' And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. What's a presidential term? No, just kidding. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is those who dwell in heaven." Last bit here. "And also it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation, and all who dwell on earth will worship it. Everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of the life of," that was cut off there, "of the slain lamb." All right, so a lot of texts there describing this beast. Remember, what we've already learned in the book of Revelation is these images are rarely literal. They're describing something deeper. They're pointers to something more profound. They're usually cultural and political images in that culture to explain something more vast and complex. And this isn't foreign to us. We do this all the time. We have political satire, cultural satire to explain what is happening in our world. We have our own beasts. What you would see here is two dogs circling each other with blue Fs on their tails, or maybe a beast in the ground. For someone 500 years ago, they look at these images and be like, they'd have no idea what they're seeing. Some beast in the ground with his nose coming out, looks like a temple in the front of a government building. They wouldn't know, but for us, if we look long enough, we can catch the message of what these images are saying to us. And so what is this beast then about? What is it pointing to? Well, it used interesting language to describe the beast. It's a beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear, and its mouth were like a lion's mouth. This is all pointers to the Old Testament, to Daniel 7 specifically. Daniel has a vision in chapter 7 of 4 beasts that literally exact same thing. 4 beasts came out of the sea. One was a leopard representing Greece, one was a lion representing Babylon, and a bear, Persia, and a Roman Empire. These 4 beasts represent political power. And what Revelation is trying to do in this picture of the beast, it's an amalgamation of these 4 creatures all rolled into one, representing political power opposing God's kingdom. Now, all throughout history, people and scholars have tried to point fingers to who this actual beast is. Napoleon got thrown some shade. Martin Luther even, or the Pope, depending what side of the debate you were on, were thought to be the beast. Ronald Reagan was thought to be the beast as well, simply because his first, middle, and last name all had 6 letters in it. 666, you see? Yep, you got to think ahead. But maybe it's less about a distinct moment and a distinct figure, and it's more because the clues we're given here of this using Babylonian imagery, using Greek, using Persian imagery, and pulling that from the Old Testament tells us it's more probably like a type of political power that pokes its head up every once in a while throughout history and is resilient. The text we read, one of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but the mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. That speaks about the resilience of these powers that are against God's kingdom. Like, these aren't even theologians, just secular artists can pick up on those notes that you pull down a dictator, and what happens? Another dictator comes up right behind it. These powers are resilient that are opposing God and his kingdom. What Darrell Johnson says, just when Nazism gets knocked off, communism rears its head up. Just when communism gets knocked off, nationalism rears its head up. Leopard, bear, lion, over and over again. And I think here, in this complex text here's probably 2 things that I think applies to us today. The first one, catch this, is I think we need to have a healthy suspicion towards political institutions, even in our own Western democratic backyard. Now, hear what I'm saying on that. Keyword healthy. I'm not talking about like WikiLeaks links and like going in deep dives and like Area 51 stuff. That's not what we're saying here. I think it's much more, are you convinced that the inbreaking of Jesus' kingdom will come through blank party? Or when you think of Jesus' kingdom, when you watch your own self and your own heart, have you reduced Jesus' kingdom to a set of policies on major issues? And your participation isn't evangelism, isn't prayer, isn't justice work, or anything like that. No, your only Christian work is to vote right. Like, is that the sum total of your Christian walk? Is to allow politicians to do the heavy lifting for you, to bring about what Jesus has for this world. And I get it. These are confusing and challenging waters that we are treading lately. Just coming out of June, as you guys know, there was obviously been many pride parades all throughout the U.S. and Canada, And what's interesting and was actually quite unexpected for this year is in some cities like Victoria, Toronto, and then the States, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and other cities, there has been these massive blockades of pro-Palestine protesters trying to stop the LGBT pride parades. You saw all over the news. And once journalism actually found out what were the reasons for why they were blockaded, because they believed many of the corporate pride sponsors were also Zionist supporters. So they are actually against the pride parades. And it actually blew up into some violent moments where there were pushback. Pride parade was pushing against the blockade. What's fascinating is these young people, many years ago or even months ago, perhaps saw the pride parade as virtuous, as something to push for, something to advocate, now see it as oppressive, something to stop. In some places, actually broke out into violence. But simultaneously, what's happened in other places in the U.S. and Canada, in this month, we saw parades that were Queers for Palestine parades, all throughout cities like Los Angeles and New York. People that came around the pro-Palestine and were waving Palestinian flags, find solace in these communities that feel unheard, feel unseen, and actually were binding together. And so what we're seeing, before even commenting on any one of those parties or positions, simply if anyone were to pull back and just look at the baseline reality and recognize that these are two examples of many heated and inconsistent ideologies that have saturated the West. At times they're clashing with each other, but each believing they have the corner on justice, truth, and goodness. And here's the challenge. You and I, or anyone really, we look at something like this, and we see these examples, and we genuinely believe it can all come together. It can all be solved. It can all become peaceful if we just vote for the right party. If you think about just getting the right guy or gal in the chair, and John in this text is calling you out, that your imagination is too narrow to what God is doing. You simply put God into the place of politics, being the vehicle that will solve all moral disorder in the world. It might clean up the streets, but it cannot clean up the hearts of men and women. The church is the hope of the world, not the White House. But we're all reading the teleprompter. We all get caught up in the same thing. If you watched the presidential debate a couple weeks ago, I think most people thought it'd be way more heated than it was. It was actually quite subdued. And I think a lot of people thought the impact of the debate would have been way more catastrophic. Like there was literal civil war talk, not like fun, like hashtag, like there was conversation around what potentially could happen. The right and the left leaning further into their categories, cementing their position, the center dissolving, the idea of who really actually thinks they have the corner and what the U.S. is. And what was interesting was the consensus through the news and media was the nation, after the debate, it was way more subdued and deflated. I think because most Americans recognized their options were quite bleak. There was a massive hashtag that ran around Twitter called, it was con man versus old man. Those were the options. Because they put all their hope of all the moral disorder, all the things that are pushing up against them as citizens, they put all of that hope of solving that in a president. And now they are feeling hopeless. Do we vote? Of course. Do we stay informed? Yes. Do we write to our MPs? If you want to. However, I think the book of Revelation reminds us to be scrappy, knowing that more times than not, political power can be opposed to Christ's work, not for it. So we have to be discerning, knowing our allegiance isn't to a political party, isn't even to a worldview, but is to Jesus, the slain Lamb. And so the second thing that I think is important that we can pull from this is it's easy to look at a text like this, easy to look at the description of a beast, describing arrogant kings, emperors, parties all through history that went the way of the beast. In Scripture, we see that. King of Babylon in Isaiah 14, king of Tyre, Ezekiel 28, even Pharaoh in Ezekiel 29 gets described, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, you great monster lying among your streams. It's almost like he's described as a giant serpent resting on the Nile River. And even in history, Domitian, Caligula, Nero, all exalted themselves as king, all exalted themselves to be like God. They took the way of the beast. It's easy to point fingers at people and figures like this. But this is what one commentator says, but what should frighten us even more is that the same spirit of self-defined emperor remains in every human heart that seeks to make itself the center of life while bearing thoughts of its own mortality. You and I, we have the same compulsion in us. Potentially the only difference between Nero or any of these figures is these guys just had the resources to do it. Like, I'm a pretty relaxed guy. If you know me, I'm pretty easygoing. It takes a lot to get me flustered until I had children. They do that. It's just they have that ability to do that for you. What surprised me a bit, if I'm honest, is my anger and impatience kind of rose to the surface more than I was probably comfortable with. And it's not like these were new sins that just out of nowhere just clinged onto me and were just foreign things. It's that the right pressures brought to the top was always been deep and dormant below. An unsanctified area of impatience, when it got squeezed out, I recognized needed work. I needed Jesus to actually mold and form that area of my life. You see, just because you are poor doesn't mean you don't have greed lurking deep below. And just because you have no authority at your work doesn't mean you don't have a twisted view of power deep down below. In pastoral meetings, when I've met with a handful of people, I remember just when one guy just talking about his weekend and he just got drunk, he got hammered, he's talking about, man, I don't know what came over me, and I just had this moment of weakness. And they often use disassociation language. If you notice that, if you're consulting with a friend, they'll say things like, I feel like I was a different person that night. That's so unlike me. I'm not acting myself these days. And it's tempting, especially as a pastor, to empathize with them. To say, like, yeah, man, that's not you. You're better than that. And there's maybe some truth to that. But in all reality, when new pressures emerge for any of us, whether it be a wild party where everyone's drinking, or maybe that girl or that guy that's leaning in a little heavier late at night, that huge paycheck that comes with some pretty shady strings attached, these moments squeeze out not some disassociated person that makes a reckless decision. No. They squeeze out the truest person in you. Your true and actual character. The reason you rush to a shady paycheck with 2 extra zeros on it, money you've never seen in your life, is not because you are now greedy, it's because you always have been. And now you just have the opportunity to act on it. There are things below at deep layers in our hearts that always don't get attention. So our job is not to deflect using disassociation language, but to embrace our reality that there's still work to do in all of us. We recognize there's something beastly in our hearts, like Pharaoh and Nero, and all the way back to Adam who bit the fruit, that we need God to graciously and lovingly go to the deepest undisturbed layers and put the beast out of its misery, to chip away those areas of our life that need work and to make us into the image of his Son. That is the work that he lays out for us. When you look at the second beast, the first beast is all about power. And the second beast, starting at verse 11. This is how the second beast is described. Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth and had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast and in its presence and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also, a course of all, it both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand of the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. That is the name of the beast of the number of its, name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. There's a familiar passage to many of us. So we see Wild Thing 1 is all about power, and Wild Thing 2, the beast of the earth, is about propaganda. Another way commentators say this is about politics and religion, power propped up by belief. And when we read a chapter like this, I think, honestly, many of us are most concerned about the first beast. Why? Because verse 6 says it was allowed to make war on the saints and conquer them, bring about suffering, death of believers. See, you and I are self-preserving creatures. We want to squeeze out as many days as we can in this world. Yet, what we see in verse 6 is all across the world, the beast is doing just that. He's terrorizing, he's oppressing believers. And even the past century, there's reports of Christians in places like Sudan where Christians are being enslaved and even crucified. Korean Christians in World War II were imprisoned and tortured when they refused to bow down to Shinto shrines. Chinese imprisonment. George Chen famously was forced to work all day deep in a cesspool filled with human waste. But he was rejoiced because the odor kept others away, allowing him to pray and sing as he worked all day. And while he was in prison, the church he planted grew from 300 people to 5,000 people. One of his converts was released shortly after the conversion and went back to evangelize to his unreached tribal groups in 1 month, winning 5 villages with over 750 people. Missionary after missionary, believer after believer being pressed under the claws of the beast, suffering, oppression, death. And yet, what's the consensus of these missionaries? You and I, we pity them. And for frank and honest, we don't want their lives. We want a comfortable life. But hearing from them, hearing their testimonies, how do they talk about these things? There's one witness who is in a persecuted church in Iran who looks to the West. He looks to you and I, and he said, it's a shame for a believer to die of natural causes. Wow. What we see is a win to see our great-grandkids to outlive that, to retire on the beaches of Miami, to die in warm beds. These men and women see as a loss. That's interesting. They almost pity the thing we strive so hard to gain, a quiet and comfortable death. They hold their lives loosely, and I think that resonates with the teaching of Jesus, Matthew 10:28. And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both body, soul, destroy both soul and body in hell. In other words, I think we should be much more concerned about the second beast. Why? Look what verse 14 says. In the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. You aren't going to find many passages about Jesus concerned for our physical bodies. You'll find some. They're there. but you will find a library of passages concerned about your deception of your faith. There's a parable in Matthew 25 about these virgins, and it's actually pointing to this scene here. It says, at that time, it's talking about this time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Talking about Jesus. 5 of them were foolish and 5 of them were wise. Why? Well, the foolish ones didn't have enough oil. And so they waited and waited for the bridegroom to show up, and their lamps actually went out. And so they had to go hustle. They had to run and go to Walmart or whatever to get enough oil to make it back in time before the bridegroom showed up. They didn't want to miss it. They were unprepared. And while they're over at Walmart, the bridegroom does show up. The wedding banquet starts, and the doors are shut. And you see these people rush back, these virgins rush back who are unprepared, and they're banging the door, please let us in. The bridegroom, Jesus, comes out, and he says, truly I tell you. It wasn't that he says you didn't hustle enough, or that you should have done more ministry, or that you should have given more to the poor. No, the reason you weren't allowed in is I do not know you. And to be honest, the guiding questions in our lives that keep us often up at night are my kids going to be okay? Did I do taxes right? Did I vote right? Will this relationship lead to marriage? And all that's important, but I think what Scripture pushes on, the most important question, which often doesn't get attention in our lives, is do I know God? Because there are real beastly forces out there trying to mislead you on the regular. Like this idea of these two beasts of politics and religion, power and belief being in bed together isn't a new concept. During the time when John was writing this, the Roman Empire was a fierce political force. And what came from that is emperor cults that worshiped the power of Caesar, worshiped the power of government. And these local priests from these emperor cults were called asiarchs. Acts 19, Paul is actually advised, steer clear of these guys. They are vicious. Do not go in their theaters. Their job was literally, just as John says, to say about the beast, to deceive people into worship. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. These guys would get buy-in for worship with trickery. Well, one commentator says they use hidden pulleys, literally. They use hidden pulleys, for example, to cause statues to move. They made use of ventriloquism to make people think statues or idols spoke. This is literally like Disneyland stuff. I don't even like the Tiki Hut. I was there with the kids. This is what's happening. These priests deceive people into worship using hollow spectacles of deflecting mirrors, pulleys, and smoke, all to pull at the hearts of men and women, providing alluring promises of power, pleasure, and security. Like, do you see it? Like, nothing has changed. Porn, alcohol, drugs, career power, money, all deceive our hearts to worship them with shiny spectacles and promises of the good life, and are always hollow idols with ropes and pulleys. They always overpromise and underdeliver, leaving us worse off than we started. I remember a couple weeks ago I shared about this idea of, like, can we even recognize the resistance in our city? Are we in tune as we drive down into our neighborhoods? Do we know what people put their hope into? But I think we need to even just take one step back this morning and not just assessing and discerning our city, but discerning our own hearts. Do we know where we've been deceived? Do we know where we put false hope in? What has got me off course from actually knowing God? And you might rush to, like, yeah, that's fine. I know God. But actually, take a minute. Do you? Because you know what we don't see much of in this chapter is the devil. The devil from the last chapter sends these two puppets, Beast 1 and Beast 2, working behind the scenes, not needing to be celebrated, worshiped, or recognized as long as Jesus isn't. Verse 4 talks about the worship moving from the dragon to the beast, and he is fine with that. Well, one commentator says the devil can tolerate Buddha, Muhammad, and the whole pantheon of Hindu gods, but not Jesus. In this moment, the devil puts forward two impressive and powerful entities to draw all the worship due to Jesus onto these beasts. without anyone knowing he is pulling the levers behind the curtain. And here's how I think this plays out for you and I in this room. Knowing the force of deception is always at work in our lives. You might fit into one of two camps. The first one is, for some of you, might literally know you're throwing yourself at the thralls of worshiping other things. It's obvious. It wouldn't take long to do some inventory to recognize I put my trust in something else other than Jesus. Massive compromise of your faith to gain power, pleasure, meaning in other things. And at the end of the day, you may not fully admit to this out loud, but you believe X, whatever that thing is better than Jesus. It's more pleasurable, it's more powerful, it gives me more meaning. It's more obvious, it's more outright, but it's deception nonetheless. Like the reason you work crazy amount of hours trying to make more sales, trying to make more money so you can have that luxury vacation for the family that you've neglected all year round. It's not a lack of discipline. It's not a lack of boundaries in your life, but it's a belief issue. Like, let's be honest here. You believe Jesus' call to Sabbath rest is a joke. It's for weak people. You have this stupid, like, alpha male thing about you where you think, I just need to grind harder, I need to work harder, I need to never show weakness, and I need to never rest because that's for weak people, can't move forward. You find meaning in work. That's a belief issue. The reason you can't break a cycle of pornography in your life, of course, there's so many factors to that. Neurological pathways that get formed that are hard to break, practical steps to attack addiction. I'm not downplaying it, but the root thing there that keeps tripping you up is ultimately a belief issue. Your heart ultimately believes in that moment of weakness, of clicking, of scrolling, of looking. You will find more pleasure here than any framework of sexuality Jesus calls you to. You're just not convinced. What ultimately propels us in life, all of us, is belief. So it's the one thing the devil wants to twist and derail all the time. For some of you, it's blatant. It's obvious. You could point it out right now what the thing is. That you find more affection, more love, more purpose than Jesus. And for others, potentially more concerning, the second camp, it's more subtle. When you believe you are good with God when you potentially aren't. If we learn anything in the Old Testament from the people of God, if we learn anything from these people over and over again, there's something in the human heart that rushes towards justifying our own sinful habits and covering them up. Like Jeremiah, amongst many prophets, push on the people of God all the time, and he calls out a nation. And I think this speaks to our hearts as well as saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. You do all the right things. You serve, you give, you attend church, you attend a community group, all these exterior efforts to make you feel like you're measuring up. But there is something below the surface that you do not want to draw attention to. You don't want to be honest with that thing. The real question you're avoiding, do I actually know him? Do I have any substance of faith, or is it just hollow? Is it just my parents' faith? Have I just been doing this forever? I don't even know why anymore. And you spend your energy deflecting by just doing more stuff. What C.S. Lewis says, how to avoid God. Here you go. Avoid silence, avoid solitude, avoid any train of thought that leads off the beaten track. Concentrate on money, sex, status, health, and above all, your own grievances. Keep the radio on. Live in crowds. Use plenty of sedation. So whether you are blatantly have thrown your heart into worshiping other things, or haven't even realized that your heart has subtly moved on from worshiping Jesus, the weapon of choice for the devil is the same. It's deception. And here's where we close in this passage here. What I think actually this whole chapter is getting at is that by doing that, we are missing out on something beautiful. Verse 16 says, also causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand and the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell any unless you have the mark. That is the name of the beast of the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of man, and his number is 666. So we can rush to implications, trying real-world examples of what that 666 means, but let's not miss the overarching message of what that number represents. It's less about a literal thing. It's more about a symbolic of an allegiance we have. 6 is one less than complete. 7 is the number of complete. We see that all over Scripture. Almost there, but falling short. Rabbis thought 6 was the number of incompleteness. Why 3 6s, 666? Because 3 is also the number of completeness. So the message here is these 3 6s imply the beast is completely incomplete. Or a commentator says failure upon failure upon failure, which speaks to the whole scene in chapter 13. The dragon, these 2 beasts, are a parody. They are a counterfeit. And they failed in hollow imitation of God. Look at this. The description of the dragon in Revelation 12 mimics the description of the Father in 4. The description of the beast of the sea in Revelation 13:7 mimics the description of Jesus in Revelation 5:9. The description of the beasts of the earth in Revelation 13:11-18 mimics the description of the work of the Spirit in chapter 11. It's a counterfeit. It's mimic. It's trying to be a parody of the true and actual thing. I don't know if you've ever seen those shows of the auction houses or the pawn shop things. There's always one customer. There's always like the highlight person that they interview beforehand, before it gets into the actual examining the product. It's this young lady or whatever who has like this medallion from the war that's been passed from generation to generation, or like the first draft or some of Sherlock Holmes novel or something. And she knows this thing is worth hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of dollars. It is like a one-of-a-kind thing. And they interview this woman before she goes and actually gets an exam. And you can see the tension in her, because this thing's been passed through the family generation after generation. It's sacred. It's valuable in their family. She doesn't want to give it up. But she also has dreams of what she wants to do with her life. She wants to buy a home for her family. She wants to, start a business with her husband. And she's pulled in both ways, but she thinks it's the right move because she can have this whole life ahead of her if she actually sells this thing. And so she goes to the auction house, and she goes in with this little medallion or whatever the item is. And there's always the twist. We've seen it before, where they set this thing up, and then the guy actually examines with his monocle thing, and he's looking at the thing. He's like, oh yeah, this is like 20 years old. There's like 100 of these. I'll give you $20 for it. Your grandma lied to you. And you see her face just drop when she realized she put the whole weight of her life on something that's counterfeit. And there are people in our cities that are doing that every day, that are putting all their faith, all their worship, all their affection on something incomplete, something less, something counterfeit that will never measure up to what is holy, what is good, what is righteous, the one and true God. And if we can just end, I think the call is for us to check ourselves and not settle for anything less than King Jesus. Not only because he is the only one worthy of all our praise, our life, our worship, but because even though deceptive forces offer us all the sweet flavors of the world, he is the only one that can give us life and life abundant. And so, Father, as a church who lives in the West, who lives in Canadian culture, there are deceptive forces at work. Some of those forces are just lulling us to sleep with comfort and pleasure, especially in Vancouver. It's just a recreational city. And we can become irrelevant and useless to the kingdom because we've just made our priorities pleasure. Making sure our family is all set up perfectly, making sure our marriage is perfect, making sure we have perfect plans for the weekend. We bought all the toys and everything, that our garage is filled with all the fun things to hit up, whatever, have the mountains for snow. All those are fun and well, but they can also be distraction from the real thing. They can catch our heart off guard. We can find ourselves worshiping the wrong thing. And so, Jesus, we spend a moment here and now Holy Spirit, I pray you would do the work of revealing the deepest layers of our heart that are undisturbed, that are misaligned with you, that maybe have beastly nature to them. Even ourselves, wanting to go the way of the beast, being pulled into that, making our world ourselves, making ourselves God in our own universe. Lord, help us be a church right now, this moment, that could just put all that before you. And help us get a glimpse once again that you are superior, you are better, you are richer, you're more beautiful, you're more majestic than anything counterfeit this world has to offer. We pray that in your name.
Thank you so much for joining us online. We really hope you were encouraged, as Pastor Victor reminded us, that we can't look to political powers to solve the world's problems, but it's actually through Jesus and his church that real change comes about. We would love for you to get connected with us at Village Church, and there's 2 quick ways I want to let you know on how you can do that. The first one is by attending a service with us in person. If you live close to any of our locations across Canada, we would love for you to join us in person for one of our services. The second way is by investing in the mission through your finances. If you're watching this and you're already giving to Village Church, I just want to say thank you so much for your generosity. As the student and young adults pastor, I get a front row seat each and every week, seeing the amazing things that God is doing through our next generation. And there's so many ministries and programs that we're running, and it's because of your generosity and your giving that we're able to do any of that. So I just want to say thank you so much. With all that being said, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again next time.